So would you say that these two articles that you just looked at, do they disagree with one another?
They agree with that there was a decrease in magnitude of death, but they disagree in the why.
Okay. Would it surprise you if these two articles were written by the same three people?
Today on Deep Dive, the effects of Australian gun control laws, what popular media says, what scholars say, and why things are not as straightforward as they may appear.
This message comes from Deep Dive sponsor, Thing in a Box. You like things? You like when stuff is in a box? Wouldn't it be great to get a monthly Thing in a Box? Go to thinginabox.com and use offer code DEEPDIVE to get a 1-month free trial.
In 1996, Australia suffered the worst mass murder in all of Australian history. In response, the Australian government enacted significantly stricter gun control laws and a gun buyback program that removed 600,000 guns from circulation. This serves as a fascinating case study regarding the effects of gun control legislation. Did the implementation of stricter gun control laws reduce violence in Australia? In order to answer this question, I started by taking a look at various articles by popular media outlets regarding the 1996 Australian gun control laws to get a feel for the general public consensus surrounding the effects of these laws. One article by a magazine called Slate said that the results of these policy changes are clear. They worked really well. Another article by the BBC, while remaining more objective, states that rates of homicides, suicides, and mass shootings in Australia have all gone down since 1996, implying that the policy changes are likely responsible. I asked a few Boston University students to read portions of these two articles and to summarize what the general stance of popular media appears to be regarding the effects of the 1996 gun control legislation. Here's what a couple of them had to say.
They're assuming the correlation between stricter gun laws and a decrease in shootings.
They seem to all agree that Australian gun control laws had a positive impact on mass shooting, reducing mass shootings.
A sensible starting place for analyzing these media claims is looking at the academic studies cited by the articles. It turns out looking only this far already started to poke holes in these articles. Both articles cite the work of a professor named Philip Alpers, with the Slate magazine article citing a specific study he co-authored. However, neither the study cited by Slate nor a study written by the same three authors a few years later provide sufficient evidence for the claims made by popular media. At first glance, the study cited by the Slate article seems like it would provide this evidence. In a summary of its conclusions on the first page, it states that Australia's gun control legislation was followed by more than a decade free of fatal mass shootings and accelerated declines in firearm deaths, particularly suicides. Yet, it never explicitly states that the legislation caused the decline in violence, and this seems to be because its findings do not provide sufficient evidence for such a claim. Particularly, the study found that homicide rates were dropping prior to the introduction of the legislation, and although this decline accelerated slightly after the introduction of the legislation, the trend failed to reach statistical significance. Furthermore, another study written a few years later by three of the same authors concludes that although there was an accelerated decline of firearm homicide and suicide following the legislation, there was a decline in total non-firearm suicide and homicide deaths of a greater magnitude. Therefore, it concluded that it is not possible to determine whether the change in firearm deaths can be attributed to the gun law reforms. In order to test just how differently these two studies present their findings, I had the Boston University students read both studies without telling them they were by the same three authors. Here's what one of them had to say in regards to the first study.
So in 1996, there was gun law reform in Australia, and it reduced. They showed that there was a reduction in homicide rates and suicide rates and mass shootings in the decade after.
And the second study.
It's saying that there is a more rapid decline in deaths from when after the law reform was put in place in 1996 than before. But then it's proposing that this cannot be attributed to gun law reform.
Okay. So would you say that these two articles that you just looked at, do they disagree with one another?
They agree with that there was a decrease in magnitude of death, but they disagree in the why.
Okay. Would it surprise you if these two articles were written by the same three people?
Yeah.
It would? Why would it surprise you?
Because they changed their attitude.
By comparing the two studies in this way, it is clear that the first study presents its findings in a misleading way, and that neither study provides sufficient evidence for the claims made by many popular media outlets. Furthermore, other studies provide evidence that suggests factors other than the legislation may have led to observed declines in violence. For instance, a study from the Journal of Interpersonal Violence compared Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and found that Canada and New Zealand saw similar declines in violence to Australia, despite having considerably looser gun control laws. Another study by the British Journal of Criminology analyzed rates of violence in Australia before and after the legislation and found no significant difference in declining firearm homicide rates after the legislation was introduced. Based on the issues with the studies cited by popular media outlets and the findings of other available studies, it is safe to say that, contrary to the popular media narrative, the effects of the 1996 gun control legislation in Australia are inconclusive. Deep Dive is written, recorded, and produced by me, Zach Bodai. Thank you for listening.